They say an alpha is born to rule, to command, to never bow. But what happens when the very pack you bled for decides you're the disease? When the throne you built with your own hands becomes the altar where they sacrifice you? This is the story of a king who became nothing and a ghost who became everything. Stick with me until the end of this saga, because what you're about to witness will redefine everything you thought you knew about power, betrayal, and resurrection. Hit that like button and drop your city in the comments. Let me know where my tribe is watching from. The citadel of Ashenmoor rose like a black tooth against the crimson sky, obsidian towers clawing at clouds that never broke. Inside its walls, power didn't whisper. It roared. It bled. It devoured anything weak enough to hesitate. King Draven Kalor stood at the center of it all, a monument carved from violence and calculation. 6'4" of coiled muscle and scars that told stories his mouth never would. Silver eyes that could strip a man's courage with a glance. Hair dark as split coal, always kept short, always controlled. Everything about him screamed dominance. The way he moved through rooms like he owned the oxygen, the way lesser alphas lowered their gaze before he even spoke. He had built this empire from the corpses of the old one, dragged it from chaos into order through sheer, brutal will. 20 years on the throne. 20 years of holding together a kingdom of predators who would tear each other apart the second he showed weakness. And he had shown none. Until her. Elena Vale. A human. A servant. A ghost in the machine of his empire. She moved through the palace like smoke, quiet and unremarkable. Brown hair always tied back, simple gray uniform, eyes that never met anyone's directly. The kind of invisible that takes effort, the kind that keeps you alive in a world where being noticed by the wrong person means being erased. 5'3", maybe 110 pounds soaking wet. Narrow shoulders that curved inward like she was trying to take up less space in the world. Hands roughened from years of scrubbing floors, organizing supplies, carrying out orders without question. Her face was plain in the way that disappears from memory the moment you look away. No sharp angles, no distinctive marks. Just a collection of features that added up to forgettable. That was survival. Draven had seen her 1,000 times and never truly looked. She was part of the scenery, like the stone walls or the torches that burned eternal in their sconces. Functional. Forgettable. That was the point. But 3 months ago, something shifted. It started small. A supply manifest that didn't match the delivery. Medical stores depleted faster than usage reports indicated. Whispers in the barracks about loyalty bought and sold. The kind of discrepancies that could mean clerical error or could mean something bleeding the empire from within. Caspian Thorn brought it to him first. The second alpha, Draven's right hand, a man forged in the same fires but tempered with ambition that burned slow and patient. Tall, lean, with eyes like chips of amber and a smile that never quite reached them. Where Draven was raw power barely leashed, Caspian was precision. The kind of man who could cut your throat while shaking your hand and you'd thank him for the courtesy. He'd been at Draven's side for 15 years, saved his life twice. Draven had returned the favor 3 times. That was the bond between them. Blood and debt, and the understanding that in a kingdom of predators, you needed someone watching your back who was almost as dangerous as you. Almost. Caspian laid the reports on Draven's desk with the careful precision of a man presenting evidence at a trial. "We have a problem," he said. His voice was smooth, cultured, the accent of old money and older bloodlines. "Someone's bleeding us from the inside." Draven had looked up from the territory maps he'd been studying, maps that showed the kingdom's expansion plans, the border conflicts that never truly ended, the endless game of chess played with lives instead of pieces. "Show me." The investigation took weeks. Caspian led it personally, peeling back layers of the palace infrastructure like skinning an animal. What they found made Draven's blood run cold in a way combat never had. Someone had been siphoning resources for months. Medicine, weapons, information. Small amounts, carefully hidden, but consistent. Building a network so subtle, so carefully hidden, that only its shadow remained visible, and every thread led back to the same place. The servant quarters, specifically to a young woman who cleaned the medical wing, who restocked the armory supplies, who had access to documents most soldiers never saw. Elena Vale. Draven remembered the moment Caspian brought her file, how thin it was, how utterly unremarkable. Parents dead in a border raid 12 years ago. No family, no connections, perfect service record. Never a complaint, never a commendation. Just years of being exactly where she was supposed to be, doing exactly what she was told. 26 years old. 12 of them spent serving the palace. Half her life erasing herself for their comfort. Too perfect, Caspian had said, tapping the folder. That's what made me look closer. And beneath that perfect surface, they found cracks. Small anomalies. Times she'd been in places she shouldn't have been. Explained away by reassignments that upon deeper investigation, nobody could quite verify. Conversations overheard by guards who remembered her presence but couldn't remember why she'd been there. One guard said she'd been in the weapons vault. Another said he'd seen her near the council chambers after hours. A third swore she'd been in the medical archive reviewing restricted files. When questioned, she had explanations. Reassignments. Orders from supervisors who turned out to not exist or couldn't remember giving such orders. The evidence was circumstantial. Damning. We bring her in, Caspian said, quietly. Find out who she's working for. But Draven had hesitated. Something about it felt wrong, like a note played off key in a familiar song. He'd built his reign on instinct as much as strategy, and his instinct said this was too neat. You ever see a trap that looks like coincidence? He asked. Caspian's amber eyes studied him. You think someone's setting her up? I think it's convenient. Girl with no connections, no protection, perfect access. She's either a mastermind or a patsy. Does it matter? That question hung between them like smoke. Give me 48 hours, Draven said. I want to be sure. He never got them. Because the next night, the council moved. The Council of Elders, 7 alphas who'd served since before Draven took the throne, who represented the old bloodlines, the old ways. They'd accepted his rule because he was strong enough to hold it, but they'd never loved him, never truly submitted. Draven had taken the throne by killing the previous king, his own father, in single combat. It was the old way, the blood right that couldn't be challenged. But the council had served his father, had profited under the old regime's corruption and excess. Draven's reforms had cost them. His insistence on merit over bloodline, his intolerance for the old games of favor and tribute. They'd been waiting for this. Lord Vane stood at their head, silver-haired and sharp as broken glass, 70 years old but still dangerous, still carrying the kind of power that didn't fade with age. He'd lost 2 sons in Draven's wars of consolidation, sons who'd challenged the new order and paid for it with their lives. The old alpha had bowed then, had sworn fealty. But some wounds never close. They just grow teeth. The emergency session was called at midnight. The great hall of Ashenmoor, carved from a single massive cavern in the mountain's heart, its walls inscribed with the names of every alpha who'd ever ruled. Torches burned in iron brackets, throwing shadows that danced like fighting ghosts. Draven entered to find the council already assembled, already armed. Not with weapons, those were forbidden in the hall, but with something more dangerous. Certainty. The 7 of them sat in their high seats, arranged in a semicircle around the speaking floor. Behind them, other alphas filled the gallery. Territory holders, military commanders, the ones who mattered. Maybe 40 in total, all told, all watching. Vane didn't waste time with pleasantries. We have uncovered a conspiracy, he announced, his voice carrying through the chamber like a judge pronouncing sentence. One that reaches into the heart of this palace. One that has compromised our security, our resources, and our trust. Draven stood before them, reading the room with the same skill he'd read battlefields. Caspian stood to his right, face carefully neutral. The other alphas present watched with the hungry stillness of predators sensing blood. Then present your evidence, Draven said. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. And they did. For 3 hours, they laid it out. Every anomaly, every discrepancy. Building a case that pointed like an arrow at Elena Vile, financial records showing supplies requisitioned under her name, guard testimony placing her in restricted areas, a pattern of access that aligned too perfectly with the thefts. But more than that, they built a case that Draven had known, that he'd been complicit, that his hesitation to act was itself evidence of compromise. Your second brought this to your attention 3 weeks ago, Vane said. 3 weeks, and yet the traitor still walks free. Still has access, still bleeds us. I wanted to be thorough, Draven replied, to ensure we had the right person before we acted. Thorough, Vane repeated, tasting the word like poison. Or protective. The room shifted. Subtle. Dangerous. You dare suggest, Draven started. I suggest nothing, Vane cut him off. I merely observe. A human servant, unremarkable in every way, suddenly becomes the nexus of a conspiracy that threatens the kingdom. And our king, who has never hesitated to execute traitors, suddenly develops patience. Draven felt the trap closing, saw it with the clarity of experience. Perhaps the girl has leverage over our king, Vane continued, his tone poisonously gentle. Perhaps she knows something. Perhaps she is not working alone. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre. Draven felt the shift in the room. The way loyalty became question. The way certainty became doubt. He'd fought 100 battles, killed more men than he could count, clawed his way to the throne through blood and fire. But this was different. This was politics. And in politics, perception was reality. He could see it in their faces. The alphas who'd served him for years suddenly wondering if he could be compromised by a human girl, if the strength they'd sworn allegiance to was cracking. An alpha's power wasn't just physical, it was psychological. The absolute belief that nothing could break them, nothing could turn them, nothing could make them weak. Doubt was death. He could have fought it, could have demanded proof, demanded time, torn Vane's throat out, right there for the insult. But that would only prove their point. A king secure in his power doesn't need to defend it. So he made the choice that would haunt him. Bring her in, he said. Let her answer these charges herself. They dragged Elena Vale into the great hall at dawn. Draven saw her then, truly saw her, for the first time. She looked exactly as she always had, small, plain, terrified. Her wrists bound behind her back, 2 guards gripping her arms, forcing her to kneel on the cold stone floor. She was shaking. He could see it from across the hall, her whole body trembling like a leaf in a storm. There were bruises on her face. Fresh ones. The guards had been rough bringing her in. Her gray uniform was torn at the shoulder. Her hair had come loose from its usual tight bun, falling around her face in tangled strands. She looked up at the assembled alphas with the expression of someone who'd just woken up in a nightmare and couldn't figure out how to wake up for real. But her eyes. When she looked up at him, there was something there he hadn't expected. Not guilt, not defiance. Confusion, pure and absolute. Like a person waking up in a burning building and not understanding how the fire started. Lord Vane read the charges. His voice echoed through the hall, each word falling like a hammer blow. Treason, conspiracy against the crown, theft of royal resources, espionage, aiding enemies of the state. Each charge carried a death sentence. Together, they were overkill. How do you answer? Vane demanded. Elena's voice was barely a whisper. I don't understand. I haven't done anything. I've only ever served... Lies. Vane cut her off. We have evidence. We have testimony. Guards who saw you in restricted areas, manifests with your handwriting, supply requests bearing your signature. That's my job, she said, voice trembling but trying to hold steady. I inventory supplies. I'm supposed to be there. Those are my duties. Convenient, Vane sneered. How convenient that your duties align so perfectly with the scope of this betrayal. Tell me, girl, who are you working for? Which enemy paid you to destroy us from within? No one, Elena said. I swear. I haven't done anything wrong. I've served this palace for 12 years. I've never... 12 years, Vane interrupted. 12 years of pretending. 12 years of building trust so you could betray it. Who recruited you? Was it the northern clans, the eastern territories, or perhaps something closer to home? That last part was directed at Draven. Elena's eyes went wide. No, I would never... I don't even know what you're talking about. Please, there's been a mistake. I'm just a servant. I clean floors. I count bandages. I'm nobody. Nobody, Vane repeated. Yes, that's precisely what makes you perfect. Nobody pays attention to nobody. Nobody questions nobody. You've been invisible for 12 years, and in that invisibility, you've had access to everything. Draven watched it unfold like watching a snare close around an animal's leg. Efficient, brutal, inevitable. He He could stop it. One word from him, and this ended. But to what end? The evidence was there. Circumstantial, yes. But in a court of alphas, circumstance was enough. And if he intervened now, if he protected her without proof of her innocence, the council's suspicions would only grow. They would see weakness, and weakness in a king was death. So he stayed silent, and that silence was its own verdict. Elena's gaze found his across the hall, 30 feet of empty stone between them. She looked at him the way the drowning look at the shore, desperate, pleading, uncomprehending why salvation wouldn't come. "Please," she said. The word broke on her lips. "My king, please. I've done nothing, I swear it. I swear on everything. I've only ever tried to serve well, to be useful, to stay out of the way. Please don't let them—" Her voice cracked. Tears were streaming down her face now. Not the calculated tears of manipulation, the raw, ugly tears of someone breaking apart. "I have no one," she whispered. "Nowhere to go. This palace is my home. You are my king. I've never questioned, never complained. I've done everything asked of me. Please, please believe me." Draven's jaw tightened. Every instinct he'd honed over decades screamed that this was wrong, that the pieces fit too perfectly, that someone had arranged this tableau like a stage play. But instinct wasn't evidence, and he couldn't afford to look weak. Caspian stepped forward then, smooth as oil on water. "My king, if I may." The girl's testimony is understandably emotional, but emotion is not exculpation. Perhaps a more thorough investigation is warranted. We could hold her in the black pits until we can verify her claims, give the intelligence corps time to trace the full network, discover her handlers, root out the entire conspiracy. The black pits. Everyone in the room knew what that meant. The dungeons beneath Ashenmoor weren't designed for comfort or reformation. They were designed for breaking prisoners, for storing the kingdom's darkest secrets, for making problems disappear. Sending Elena there was as good as killing her, just slower. Elena made a sound. Not quite a scream. Worse. The sound an animal makes when it realizes the trap is closed and there's no escape. "No," she said. "No, please, not there. Please, I'll confess to anything. I'll say whatever you want. Just please don't send me there. Please." "So you admit guilt?" Vane pounced. "No." Elena shook her head frantically. "No, I don't want to go to the pits. Nobody comes back from the pits. Please. There has to be another way. House arrest, exile, anything. I'm begging you." Draven met Caspian's eyes. Saw something flicker there, something that might have been regret or might have been satisfaction. With Caspian, you could never quite tell. The second suggestion was perfectly reasonable, logical, the safe play. If she was guilty, time in the pits would break her and she'd reveal her co-conspirators. If she was innocent, she'd be cleared eventually and could be released. It was the middle ground, the compromise. Except everyone knew what the pits did to people, human or alpha. 3 weeks down there and you came back changed, if you came back at all. The king looked back at Elena, at this small, terrified girl who'd served his household for years without complaint, who'd never asked for anything, never caused trouble, who might be a traitor, or might be a pawn. He couldn't afford to care which. The weight of 40 alphas' gazes pressed down on him, waiting, watching, testing. This was the moment. This was the choice that defined whether he was still strong enough to rule. "Do it," he said. 2 words that changed everything. Elena's face crumpled, not with rage, with betrayal so total it looked like physical pain. "No," she whispered. "No, please, I didn't." The guards hauled her to her feet. She struggled, but what good was struggling? She was human. They were alphas. It was like a sparrow fighting a hawk. Her feet dragged across the stone. She was still trying to speak, words tumbling out in a desperate stream. 12 years. I've served for 12 years. I've never asked for anything. I sleep in a closet. I eat scraps. I own nothing. I am nothing. How could I be a threat? How could I possibly— "My king," she cried out as they dragged her toward the hall's rear exit. "My king, please look at me. Please. You know me. You've seen me. I'm the one who organizes the medical supplies. I'm the one who makes sure your chambers are warm in winter. I'm the one who—" "Nobody," Vane's voice cut through her pleading. "You are nobody, as you yourself admitted, and nobody does not address the king as though you have the right to his attention. Elena's eyes found Draven's one last time, and in that moment he saw the exact instant something died inside her. Not hope, something deeper. The belief that the world made sense, that there were rules, that if you followed them, you'd be safe. "My king," she said one last time. Quiet now, almost calm. "I forgive you for not believing me, but you will remember this. You will remember my face, and when you discover the truth, when you realize what you've done—" "Silence her," Vane ordered. One of the guards clamped a hand over her mouth. They dragged her through the doors. Draven turned away. It was the mercy he could offer, not looking, not watching as hope died in someone's eyes. But he heard her, heard the moment the pleading stopped and something else began. Not a scream, worse, a sound like something breaking that would never be whole again. The doors slammed shut. The echo rang through the hall like a death knell. Silence flooded the chamber. Lord Vane inclined his head. "A wise decision, my king. You have proven that no one, no matter how insignificant, is above the law, that you cannot be swayed by sentiment or manipulation." The other council members murmured agreement. Draven didn't acknowledge it. He stood there, staring at the throne at the far end of the hall, the seat he'd killed to claim and killed to keep. It looked smaller than it had an hour ago. The council dispersed, the gallery emptied, alphas filing out with the satisfied air of predators who'd just watched a successful hunt. Caspian lingered, waiting until they were alone. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. "Did I?" It wasn't a question. "The evidence is there, Draven. If she's innocent, we'll find out. If she's guilty, she'll break and reveal her network. Either way, the kingdom is protected. You're protected." Draven turned to look at him. Really, look at him. Caspian met his gaze steadily. Honest. Open. The face of a man who'd been his brother in all but blood for 15 years. "We'll never know," Draven said. "Because the pits don't produce confessions, Caspian. They produce corpses, and you know it." Caspian's expression didn't change. "Then perhaps you should have thought of that before you gave the order, my king." Something cold settled in Draven's chest, something that felt like recognition. "Get out." Caspian smiled, small, controlled. The smile of a man who just won something and was gracious enough not to gloat. "Of course, my king. I'll oversee the intelligence investigation personally. We'll get to the bottom of this." He left Draven alone in the great hall, standing beneath the names of all the kings who'd come before. Strong men, brutal men, men who'd made hard choices and lived with the consequences. Draven wondered if any of them had ever felt this hollow. The price of the crown, his father had told him once, years before Draven killed him and took that crown for himself. The price is everything you were before you wore it. Your conscience, your compassion, your ability to sleep peacefully. You trade it all for power. And the terrible thing is, it's worth it. Because without power, everything else is just a pretty dream waiting to be crushed. Draven was beginning to understand what that meant. He walked to the throne and sat down. The stone was cold beneath him, unforgiving, like everything else in this kingdom. 3 days passed. The palace returned to its normal rhythms. The investigation continued, led by Caspian's intelligence operatives. They found more evidence. Always more evidence. A network that seemed to grow deeper the more they dug. Too deep, Draven thought. Too perfect. But he said nothing. Because something was happening that he couldn't ignore. The council had stopped questioning him. The whispers of compromise had vanished. The other alphas looked at him with renewed respect. He'd proven his loyalty to the kingdom over any individual, even a helpless girl. Especially a helpless girl. Because mercy was weakness. Compassion was liability. And a king couldn't afford either. Draven threw himself into his duties. Territory disputes, military planning, economic reforms, the endless machinery of empire that never stopped grinding. But at night, alone in his chambers, he found himself thinking about her, about the way her voice had broken when she'd said please, about the 12 years she'd spent being invisible, about the fact that in 12 years she'd never once caused a problem, never been late, never been insubordinate, never asked for advancement or reward, just quiet, efficient, invisible. Was that the behavior of a mastermind traitor, or of someone who'd learned that the best way to survive was to not be noticed? He didn't have answers, only questions that kept him awake. On the fourth day, Caspian came to him in the war room. "We have a problem." Draven looked up from the supply reports he'd been reviewing, cross-referencing them with the pre-investigation numbers. Looking for the pattern. Looking for the lie. What kind of problem? The kind that walks on two legs and climbs walls like a spider. Draven's blood went cold. "She escaped." "No," Caspian said. "Worse. She's still down there. But something's changed. The guards are reporting anomalies. Explain." Caspian laid a report on the table. Draven read it with growing unease. 3 guards injured, 1 dead. Not killed in a fight, that would be expected. But drained. Like something had pulled the life right out of him. The creatures in the pits were kept there for a reason. Failed experiments from the old regime, from Draven's father's time. Attempts to create super soldiers, to manufacture alphas instead of waiting for them to be born. Bioweapons that had proven too unstable to control. Things that weren't quite dead and weren't quite alive. They were supposed to be contained in the deep levels. Separated from the prisoners. "She's doing something down there," Caspian said. "Learning something. The guards say she's not running from the creatures anymore. She's not even afraid of them. Then what's she doing?" Caspian's amber eyes held something Draven hadn't seen before. Fear. "She's talking to them," he said. "And they're listening." Draven stood up slowly. "That's impossible. Those things are mindless. Feral. The guards say otherwise. They say she moves through the deep levels like she owns them, that the creatures follow her, protect her." "How long?" "How long what? How long has this been happening and you didn't tell me?" Caspian had the grace to look uncomfortable. 2 days. "I wanted to confirm the reports before—" 2 days, Draven repeated. His voice was soft, dangerous. "And you thought you'd wait. I thought it was hysteria. Guards seeing things in the dark. But then the body showed up. Marcus Thel, 12-year veteran, found in the lower passage with no wounds, no trauma. Just empty." "Show me," Draven said. "My king, I don't think—" "I said, show me." They descended, down through the palace foundations, through the cellars where wine and grain were stored, through the armories and storage vaults, down to the iron doors that marked the entrance to the black pits. 2 guards stood watch. They looked pale, nervous. They should be. If what Caspian said was true, something was loose down there that shouldn't be. The doors opened with a groan of metal. Torchlight flickered in the passage beyond. Cold air rushed up to meet them. It smelled of stone and water and something else. Decay. Not the clean decay of death, but something older. Wronger. They walked down. The passages were narrow, carved from the mountain's roots. Every 50 feet, another iron door. Another layer of security. 7 levels down, they reached the cells where Elena had been placed. The door hung open. Draven's hand went to the blade at his hip. The cell was empty. The chains that should have held her lay broken on the floor. Not cut. Broken. Like something with strength far beyond human had simply pulled them apart. "Where is she?" Draven said. "The guards don't go past this level anymore," Caspian replied. "Not since Thel. But they hear things. Movement in the deep passages, sounds that aren't quite human." Draven looked at the broken chains, at the scratches on the walls, at the dried blood on the floor. "What have I done?" he whispered. "My king?" Draven turned to Caspian. "We're sealing the pits, all of them. Nothing goes in, nothing comes out. But the investigation is over," Draven said. "Whatever she was when we sent her down here, she's not that anymore. And what is she now?" Draven looked at the darkness beyond the cell, at the passage that led down into the deep places where his father's mistakes still lived. "Something we should have let rest," he said. But in the darkness below, Elena Vale stood among the creatures that had once been human and smiled. Because she'd learned something down here in the forgotten dark. The world didn't care about justice. It didn't care about innocence or guilt. It only cared about power. And she'd just discovered she had more of it than anyone realized. The darkness below Ashenmoor had teeth, not the clean bite of a blade or the honest brutality of fangs, but something older, something that understood hunger at a level most living things had forgotten. Elena Vale stood in that darkness and felt it recognize her. She'd stopped counting days after the first week. Time moved differently down here. measured not in sunlight and shadow, but in heartbeats, in the space between breaths. The creatures that shared these depths with her operated on rhythms that predated language, predated civilization, predated the pretty lie that humanity was somehow separate from the food chain. They weren't. Down here, that truth was inescapable. Mother circled her in the corridor, the creature's movements fluid, despite the grotesque restructuring of its skeleton. What had once been a woman now moved on limbs that bent in too many places, covered in patches of chitinous growth that gleamed dully in the phosphorescent fungus clinging to the walls. But its eyes, those were still human, still aware, still remembering what it meant to protect something. Elena reached out slowly, palm open. The gesture she'd learned meant peace in the language of predators. Mother's head tilted, considering, then pressed forward until the bony protrusion of its forehead touched Elena's hand. Warm. Everything down here was warm, heated by the geothermal vents that ran through the mountain's core. The air was thick, humid, carrying the mineral taste of deep earth and the copper tang of old blood. 3 other creatures watched from the shadows. Smaller than Mother, more aggressive. Elena had named them based on what they'd been. Soldier, still wearing the corroded remnants of armor fused to transformed flesh. Scholar, whose elongated fingers suggested hands that had once turned pages. And Child, the smallest, the one that still made sounds that weren't quite words, but weren't quite animal either. They were her pack now. The realization should have horrified her, should have sent her screaming into the kind of madness that would have been a mercy. But Elena Vale had learned something crucial in the weeks since they'd thrown her into this pit. Horror was a luxury. Survival was an instinct. An instinct didn't care what you used to be, only what you needed to become. The sound of boots on stone echoed down from the upper levels. Guards changing shift, staying well away from the deep passages where the experiments lived. Where Elena lived now, unbound and uncontained. Mother growled low, a vibration Elena felt through the stone beneath her bare feet. Not yet, Elena whispered. Her voice had changed down here. Rougher, lower, like something that had forgotten how to pretend its softness. The guards passed without incident. Elena moved deeper into the labyrinth, her pack following. The pits were vast, far larger than most people knew. 7 levels of cells and corridors, and below that, the experimental chambers. The places where Draven's father had tried to play God with flesh and will and alchemical processes that broke more than they created. Most of the subjects had died screaming. The ones that survived were down here, and they'd been alone for 20 years. Until Elena. She found the central chamber by following the heat, a vast cavern where the geothermal vents converged, creating pockets of scalding steam and pools of water heated to just below boiling. The walls were carved with symbols from the old regime, instructions and warnings in a language Elena was starting to understand. Not through study, through absorption. Every time she touched one of the creatures, every time she let them close enough to share space and breath, she felt their memories bleeding into her, fractured, distorted. But there. The old king had believed he could create perfect weapons by merging human consciousness with primal instinct, by stripping away everything weak, compassion, doubt, mercy, and leaving only the drive to dominate. He'd been half right. The process worked. The subjects transformed, gaining strength and resilience far beyond normal human limits. But consciousness didn't disappear, it just changed. Became something that remembered being human but no longer operated by human rules. And now Elena was walking the same path, not through alchemy or forced mutation, but through something the old king had never accounted for. Choice. She'd chosen to survive, chosen to learn, chosen to become something that could never be thrown away again. The water in the largest pool rippled as she approached. Something massive moved beneath the surface, disturbed by her presence. Elena knelt at the edge, ignoring the steam that burned her lungs. She placed her palm flat on the stone. "I know you're there," she said to the water. "I know what you are." The ripples stilled. Then the surface broke. What emerged wasn't a creature. Not exactly. It was closer to a force-given form, something that had undergone so many transformations that its original shape was impossible to discern. Massive, ancient, covered in layers of calcified growth and exposed muscle and eyes, so many eyes, that tracked her with alien intelligence. The others called it Leviathan. The first experiment, the prototype, It had been down here longer than any of them. Elena met its gaze without flinching, without fear, because she understood now. Fear was just another form of respect. And respect, in the language of predators, was acknowledgement of power. She had power now. Maybe not physical strength to match these creatures. Not yet. But power nonetheless. The power of understanding, of adaptation, of becoming something the system couldn't contain. Leviathan studied her for a long moment. Then it sank back beneath the water, dismissing her. Not a threat, not prey. Something else. Mother chittered softly, approval or amusement. With creatures, it was hard to tell. Elena stood, turning to face her pack. "They're coming," she said. "Soon. I can feel it." She could. The air pressure had changed over the last few days. More activity in the upper levels, more voices, the kind of preparation that preceded action. "Good," she whispered. "Let them come. Let them see what they created." Because here's the truth about transformation that nobody tells you. It doesn't happen all at once. It's not a single moment of breaking and rebuilding. It's 1,000 small deaths. 1,000 tiny choices to keep breathing when breathing hurts. To keep moving when your body begs you to stop. To keep thinking when madness would be easier. Elena had died 1,000 times in the dark. And each time she'd come back sharper. Above, in the palace of obsidian and gold, King Draven Kalor was discovering that some mistakes couldn't be sealed behind iron doors. He stood in his war room, staring at the map of the kingdom spread across the massive oak table. Territory markers, supply lines, military positions, the intricate machinery of empire laid out in miniature. All of it felt meaningless. Caspian stood across from him, amber eyes reflecting the lamplight. The second alpha looked tired. No, not tired, strained, like something was pulling at the edges of his perfect composure. "The doors are sealed," his second reported. "Triple locks. Guards posted at every entrance. Nothing gets in or out without our knowledge." Draven didn't look up from the map. "You said that 3 days ago, and it remains true. Then explain the supply thefts." Caspian went very still. "What thefts?" "Medical stores," Draven said, his finger tapping a notation on the supply manifest in front of him. 20 pounds of wound dressing, 30 vials of stimulant, surgical tools, field rations, all requisitioned yesterday under valid authorization codes. "That's not possible," Caspian said, moving around the table to look at the documents. "We locked down all supply access after we threw an innocent girl into a pit full of monsters," Draven finished. His voice was flat, cold as the stone walls around them. "Yes, I remember." "We don't know she was innocent," Caspian countered, but there was something in his tone, defensive, too quick. Draven finally looked up. "Don't we?" The silence stretched between them like a blade being slowly drawn from its sheath. Caspian recovered quickly, smoothly, the way he always did. If someone is stealing supplies using her authorization codes, it suggests her network is still active, that we were right to detain her, that there are others working with her. "Or it suggests someone is setting her up," Draven said. "Still, even now, even after she's been rotting in the pits for 3 weeks, Caspian's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You think I'm involved?" "I think someone is," Draven said, straightening to his full height. "I think this whole thing was orchestrated. The evidence was too perfect, the timing too convenient. Someone wanted her gone, and they used the Council's paranoia and my weakness to make it happen." "Weakness," Caspian repeated, tasting the word. "Is that what you call protecting the kingdom? Ensuring stability? Proving your loyalty above sentiment?" "I call it what it was," Draven said. "Fear. I was afraid of looking compromised, afraid of losing control. So I sacrificed someone who might have been innocent to prove my strength to a room full of vultures. And now? Now I can't sleep," Draven admitted. The words tasted like ash in his mouth. "I close my eyes and I see her face, the way she looked at me when they dragged her away. Like she couldn't understand how the world had become so cruel, like she'd believed in something, in order, in justice, in the idea that good service would keep you safe, and I shattered that belief in front of everyone. She was a servant," Caspian said, "a human in a kingdom of alphas. She had to know. She knew her place," Draven cut him off. "She spent 12 years being invisible, 12 years doing exactly what she was told, never asking for anything, never causing trouble. And the second it became convenient, I threw her away like trash. You made the choice any leader would make, Caspian said, his voice taking on that reasonable tone he used when he was trying to guide Draven toward a decision. The needs of the kingdom. Don't, Draven interrupted, the word sharp as a slap. Don't finish that sentence, I've heard it before. From my father, when he explained why he had to execute an entire village for one rebel's crimes. The needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. The price of order. All the pretty words we use to justify the things we do to stay in power. Then what would you have done differently? Caspian's voice rose slightly, frustration bleeding through. If you'd refused the council, if you'd protected her without proof, they would have seen weakness. They would have moved against you. The kingdom would have fractured. More people would have died. So tell me, my king, what was the better choice? I would have trusted my instincts, Draven said quietly. I knew something was wrong. I felt it in my gut. Every warrior knows that feeling, when the battlefield doesn't look right, when the enemy's positioning is too perfect, when you're being led into a trap, and I ignored it because I was more afraid of looking weak than of being wrong. You're still king, Caspian pointed out. The council respects you. The territories are stable. The empire is stronger than it's been in years. Whatever guilt you feel, whatever doubt, it doesn't change the fact that your kingdom is secure. Guilt, Draven laughed, the sound bitter and raw. You think this is guilt? This is reckoning, Caspian, because that girl is still down there, and the guards say she's not dead. They say she's changed, become something else. And when she comes back up, if she comes back up. When? Draven repeated, and this time his voice carried the absolute certainty of prophecy. When she comes back up, I'm going to have to answer for what I did. And I don't know if I'll have an answer that matters. Caspian moved around the table, his approach careful, calculated. Brother, he said, using the informal address he rarely employed outside of private moments. You're spiraling. This isn't like you. You've made hard choices before. Executed traitors, put down rebellions, ordered cities burned to stop the spread of plague. Why is this different? Because I didn't give her a chance, Draven said, the admission pulling something loose in his chest. Every other time, there was a trial. Evidence presented. The accused could speak, could defend themselves, could face their accusers. But her? I threw her to the wolves because it was convenient, because it made the problem disappear, because it was easier than doing the hard work of finding the truth. It did make the problem go away, Caspian said. The thefts stopped. The council stabilized. You proved your loyalty to the kingdom above all else, and lost something in the process. What? The part of me that knew the difference between strength and cruelty, Draven said. My father was cruel. He ruled through fear and brutality and the absolute certainty that human life was disposable. I killed him because I wanted to be different. I wanted to build something better. But in that moment, when I gave the order to throw her into the pits, I became him. You're nothing like him, Caspian said. But there was something off in his tone. Too emphatic. Like he was trying to convince himself as much as Draven. Then why do I feel like I'm wearing his crown? Draven asked. Why do I feel like every choice I make now is just another step down the path he walked? Because power demands sacrifice, Caspian said. That's the price. That's what separates kings from dreamers. Your father understood that. You understand it too, even if you wish you didn't. Maybe, Draven allowed, or maybe we've just convinced ourselves that the things we do are necessary because the alternative is admitting we're monsters. The room fell silent. After a long moment, Caspian spoke. The guards could be lying about her being alive. It's been 3 weeks. Even alphas don't last that long in the deep levels without food, without water, without light. A human? She's dead, Draven. She has to be. She's not alpha, Draven said, his voice distant, thoughtful. She's human, which means she's had to become something else to survive. And that might make her more dangerous than any alpha. You can't know that. I know what those things down there do to people, Draven said, pulling open a drawer in his desk and removing a leather-bound journal. His father's notes. I've read the reports from my father's experiments. The ones who survived the transformation process didn't just gain strength or speed. They gained something else. Adaptability. The ability to evolve in response to their environment. My father thought he was creating weapons. He was actually creating a new kind of predator. And you think this girl? I think if she's survived this long, she's done more than survive, Draven said. She's adapted, changed, become something that can exist in that environment. And if she can do that, then she's learned to hunt, Caspian finished, his face going pale. Worse, Draven said, she's learned to think like a predator while still thinking like a human. That's what my father never achieved. The subjects either lost their humanity completely and became animals, or they kept their humanity and couldn't survive the transformation. But if she's managed both, we need to go down there, Caspian said suddenly. Now, before whatever she's becoming finishes becoming it. Draven looked at him sharply. You argued against this yesterday. Yesterday I thought she was dead, Caspian said. If there's even a chance she's alive and changing into something we can't control. Then we put her down, Draven finished. Is that what you're suggesting? I'm suggesting we verify the situation, Caspian said carefully, and take appropriate action. Appropriate action, Draven repeated, like we did when we threw her down there in the first place. This is different. Is it? Draven asked. Or are we just looking for another convenient solution to a problem we created? What would you have me say? Caspian's composure cracked slightly, voice rising. That I was wrong? That we should have done things differently? Fine, I'll say it. But it doesn't change where we are now. It doesn't change what we have to do. And what's that? We go down, Caspian said. You and me. No counsel. No guards who'll talk. We find her. We see what she's become. And then we make the choice we should have made 3 weeks ago. Which is? The truth, Caspian said. Whatever it is. Even if it damns us both. Draven studied his second for a long moment, looking for deception, for manipulation, for the angle. But all he saw was a man who looked as tired as he felt. Tomorrow, Draven said. At dawn. We go together. Tomorrow, Caspian agreed. They prepared through the night. Not with soldiers or weapons or the full military escort that protocol demanded. Just 2 alphas, basic gear, and enough light to see by. If this was a reckoning, Draven wanted it to be honest. Lord Vane heard about the plan somehow. He always heard about everything, and came to Draven's chambers 2 hours before dawn. This is madness, the old alpha said without preamble, his silver hair pulled back tight, his face carved with disapproval. You risk yourself for a traitor. I risk myself for the truth, Draven corrected, continuing to pack supplies into a worn leather satchel. The truth, Vane sneered, the word dripping with contempt. The truth is that you let sentiment cloud your judgment. That girl was guilty. The evidence was overwhelming. Was it? Draven asked, not looking up. Or did someone make sure it looked overwhelming? Vane went very still. What are you implying? I'm not implying anything, Draven said, finally meeting the old alpha's gaze. I'm stating a fact. The evidence was too perfect. The timing too convenient. Someone orchestrated this. To what end? That's what I'm going to find out, Draven said. One way or another. And if the creatures kill you, Vane asked, if you don't come back? Then you'll have the excuse you've been looking for to challenge for the throne, Draven said flatly. Vane's expression hardened like cooling steel. I have never... You've hated me since I killed your sons, Draven interrupted. Don't pretend otherwise. They challenged my authority, tried to overthrow the new order. I executed them according to law. But you've wanted revenge ever since. They were my children, Vane said, and for the first time in years, something other than cold calculation showed in his eyes. Pain. Raw and ancient. They were grown men who tried to start a civil war, Draven said, but his voice was softer now. And I did what I had to do, just like I'm doing what I have to do now. By throwing yourself into the pits? That's not duty. That's suicide. Maybe, Draven allowed, or maybe it's the first time in 20 years I've actually tried to fix a mistake instead of just burying it. Vane was silent for a long moment. Then, if you don't come back, the council will elect a new king. I know, Draven said. Make sure they choose better than they did with me. He left Vane standing in the corridor, expression unreadable. Dawn broke cold and red over Ashenmoor, the sky the color of dried blood. Draven met Caspian at the entrance to the pits. Just the 2 of them. 2 alphas who'd fought together, bled together, built a kingdom together. One of them was lying. Draven just wasn't sure which one yet. Ready? Caspian asked. No, Draven said honestly. but let's go anyway. The first 3 levels were empty. Cells that had once held prisoners now stood open and abandoned. Their footsteps echoed in the silence, the sound swallowed by stone that had witnessed too much suffering. Level 4 showed the first signs of change, scratch marks on the walls, deep gouges in the stone that suggested claws or something worse, blood stains that hadn't been there before. Old blood, weeks old. The air was getting warmer, thicker. Each breath felt like swallowing soup. Level 5 was where they found the first body. Guard Marcus Thel, or what was left of him. He sat against the wall, head tilted back, eyes open but empty. No visible wounds, no trauma, no sign of struggle, just vacant, like someone had reached inside and scooped out everything that made him a person, leaving only the shell. Draven knelt beside the body, placed his hand on the guard's chest, cold, but not stiff. Not rotting, just empty. What could do this, he asked. Caspian crouched beside him, his face pale in the torchlight. The old text talked about life draining, energy vampirism, but those were myths, warnings to scare children. They were experiments, Draven corrected, pulling his hand back. My father tried to weaponize everything, including the ability to feed on living essence. Most of the subjects died. The ones that survived went down to the deep levels. And now they're loose, Caspian said. Not loose, Draven replied, studying the body's position. Directed. Look, he's sitting. Not fallen. Not collapsed. Someone put him here like this. Arranged him. Left him as a message. What message? That we're not welcome. They continued down. Level 6 was a maze of corridors and chambers. The experimental labs where the old king had conducted his research. Equipment rusted and corroded by decades of neglect. Tables still bearing leather restraints. Walls covered in notes written in a cramped, manic hand that Draven recognized as his father's. He read some of them as they passed. Formulas. Procedures. Observations about what worked and what failed and how much screaming a human body could produce before the vocal cords gave out. One note in particular caught his attention. Subject 37 shows remarkable adaptation. Unlike previous attempts, she retains full cognitive function while undergoing physical transformation. Theorized that voluntary subjects metabolize the alchemical treatments more efficiently than forced conversions. The body accepts change. It chooses rather than resisting change that is imposed. We'll continue observations. She, Draven noted, Subject 37 was female. Below the note, in different handwriting, one of his father's assistants probably, someone had added, Subject terminated following coordinated escape attempt with subjects 12 and 19. Bodies disposed of in the deep thermal pools as per standard protocol. Terminated, Draven murmured. Not killed. Terminated. Like ending a project instead of a life. His father's work had been monstrous, but clinical, methodical, treating people like problems to be solved or discarded. And now Draven had done the same thing. Thrown Elena into the dark and written her off as a problem solved. The irony was sharp enough to draw blood. You're thinking too much, Caspian said quietly. I can see it on your face. Someone should think, Draven replied. Someone should remember that we did this. That whatever we find down here, we created it. They reached level 7 as the torches began to flicker and dim, the air too thick to sustain normal flame. The heat was oppressive now. Draven's shirt clung to his back with sweat. Every breath felt like inhaling hot metal. The cells here were different, reinforced, built to contain things that normal stone and iron couldn't hold. All of them were open, empty. In the center of the level, through a wide archway carved with symbols that made Draven's eyes hurt to look at directly, they found the chamber. Vast, cathedral-like. The ceiling lost in darkness above. The walls carved with patterns that predated the kingdom. Old magic that whispered in frequencies just below hearing. And in the center, sitting on what had once been an altar used for the transformation rituals, Elena Vale. She looked up as they entered, and Draven's breath caught in his chest. She was still recognizably human, still small-framed, still delicate in bone structure. But everything else had changed. Her eyes tracked them with predator precision. No fear, no surprise. Just cold, perfect calculation. Her skin had taken on a faint luminescence, like she'd absorbed the phosphorescent glow of the fungus that grew in the deep places. Her hair, once mousy brown and always tied back, now fell loose around her shoulders, shot through with streaks of silver white that seemed to move on their own. But the biggest change was in how she held herself. No more hunching, no more making herself small, no more erasing herself from the world's attention. She sat like she owned the space around her, like she'd claimed this darkness and bent it to her will. Around her, in the shadows at the chamber's edges, things moved. The creatures. Her pack. "Hello, my king," Elena said. Her voice was different. Still hers, but underlaid with harmonics that resonated in frequencies that made Draven's teeth ache and his bones feel hollow. "I was wondering when you'd come." "Hello, my king," Elena said, her voice resonating through the chamber like a bell struck underwater. "I was wondering when you'd come." Draven stood frozen at the threshold, every instinct screaming contradictory commands. Bite, flee, protect, destroy. His hand hadn't moved to his weapon yet, but the impulse was there, coiled tight in his muscles like a snake ready to strike. Behind Elena, the creatures shifted in the shadows. Not attacking, not retreating, just watching with too many eyes that reflected the phosphorescent glow like scattered stars in a poisoned sky. Mother stood closest to her, that grotesque fusion of woman and weapon, its head tilted at an angle that suggested intelligence rather than instinct. The others, soldier, scholar, child, moved in synchronized patterns that spoke of pack dynamics, of hierarchy, of loyalty. "You're alive," Draven said. The words felt stupid the moment they left his mouth, but his brain was struggling to process what he was seeing. The girl they'd thrown down here had been fragile, terrified, broken. This creature sitting before him was none of those things. "Disappointed?" Elena asked. There was no anger in her tone, no bitterness, just curiosity, clinical and cold as a surgeon's blade. Relieved, Draven admitted, and saw something flicker across her transformed features. Surprise, maybe. Or disbelief. "That makes one of us," Elena said, standing slowly. Her movements were fluid now, liquid grace that made his predator instincts flare with warning. "Because I stopped feeling relief about 3 days into my stay in your hospitality suite." Caspian moved beside Draven, one hand resting on the pommel of his blade. His amber eyes tracked the creatures circling the chamber's perimeter with the focused intensity of a man calculating odds and not liking the numbers. "We came to find the truth," he said, his voice measured, controlled, the tone he used when negotiating with hostile territory holders. Elena's gaze shifted to the second alpha, and Draven saw her smile. It wasn't a happy expression. It was the smile of someone who'd just been handed the punchline to a joke they'd been waiting weeks to tell. "The truth," she repeated, tasting the word. "Yes, let's talk about truth." "Which truth would you like, Caspian? The one you sold to the council? The one you fed to your king, or the one you've been hiding since this whole thing started?" The temperature in the chamber seemed to drop despite the geothermal heat radiating from the vents. "Careful, girl," Caspian said, his voice taking on an edge sharp enough to cut. "You're making accusations you can't prove, can't I?" Elena took a step forward, and Mother moved with her, a massive shadow at her back. "Tell me, my king, did you ever wonder why the evidence against me was so perfect? Why every single piece pointed to me and only me? Why there were no loose threads, no inconsistencies, nothing that didn't fit the narrative?" "I wondered," Draven said quietly. His hand was on his blade now, not drawing it, just grounding himself with the familiar weight. "But you didn't ask," Elena continued, her luminous eyes locked on his. "You didn't push. You didn't demand verification. You just accepted what you were told because it was convenient, because it solved a problem, because it made the council happy and kept your throne secure." The words hit like physical blows, each one landing in a place Draven had been trying not to examine too closely. Here's what most people don't understand about betrayal. It's rarely about the act itself. It's about the moment after, when you realize you saw the signs and ignored them. When you understand that some part of you knew the truth all along, but chose comfort over confrontation. That's what eats you alive in the dark hours before dawn. Not what they did. What you let them do. What you chose not to see because seeing would have required action, and action would have been uncomfortable. Draven was beginning to feel that gnawing sensation now, chewing at his insides like acid. The supply thefts were real, Caspian interjected, his voice measured and reasonable. The evidence was verified by multiple independent sources. Independent, Elena repeated and laughed. The sound echoed off the stone walls like breaking glass. Sources you controlled, sources you paid, sources who owed you favors or feared you enough to say whatever you needed them to say. That's not verification, that's theater. That's a lie, Caspian snapped, and for the first time there was a crack in his composure. Is it? Elena tilted her head, the gesture oddly bird-like. Then explain something to me. If I was stealing supplies, what was I doing with them? I have no family, no connections outside this palace, no ability to move or sell goods. I don't even own the clothes on my back. They belong to the palace inventory. So where did it all go? To your handlers, Caspian said. The people you were working for. The network we're still trying to uncover. What people? Elena's voice rose slightly, the first real emotion breaking through that clinical calm. I've been invisible for 12 years. I sleep in a closet that's smaller than the cells on level 1. I eat in the servant kitchen at assigned times. Every second of every day is accounted for by duty rosters and cleaning schedules. So tell me, when exactly was I supposed to be running this elaborate conspiracy? Between scrubbing the medical wing floors and inventorying bandages? Draven's mind was racing now, pulling apart the case that had seemed so solid 3 weeks ago, looking for the holes and finding them everywhere. The manifests with her signature. He'd never verified the handwriting himself, just trusted Caspian's people. The guard testimony placing her in restricted areas, all from guards under Caspian's direct command. Men who owed their positions to the second Alpha. The supply requests, authorized with codes she had access to, yes. But so did a dozen other people. Supervisors, logistics officers, and Caspian himself. She's trying to manipulate you, Caspian said, and there was something desperate creeping into his voice now, urgency that didn't quite mask his concern. Can't you see it? She's had weeks down here to plan this, to twist the facts, to rehearse her defense, to make herself look innocent while the real conspirators remain hidden. Then let's examine the facts, Elena said, her voice dropping to something cold and precise as a scalpel. Starting with the most important one. The thefts didn't stop when you threw me down here, did they? Draven went very still, his heart hammered against his ribs. How do you know that? Because I know who's really behind this, Elena said, and now her smile had teeth. I've had a lot of time to think down here, a lot of time to piece together everything I saw over 12 years of being invisible. And when you're invisible, people forget you're watching. They forget you have eyes, ears, a mind that remembers. She took another step forward, and the creatures moved with her like extensions of her will. Tell him, Caspian, Elena said. Tell him about the supply network you've been building, the one that funnels resources to your private compounds in the Northern Territories. Tell him about the alphas you've been recruiting, the ones who think you'd make a better king than the man who killed his own father. That's enough. Caspian's hand went to his blade, fingers wrapping around the grip. Tell him about the council votes you've been buying, Elena continued, her voice gaining momentum like an avalanche gathering speed. The compromising information you've gathered on every elder. Lord Vane's gambling debts, Councillor Thress's bastard children, Elder Morven's embezzlement from the territorial tithes. Tell him how you've positioned yourself as the indispensable advisor while slowly undermining everything Draven built. I said enough. Caspian drew his blade, the steel singing as it cleared the scabbard. The sound echoed in the chamber like a struck chord. But Elena didn't stop, didn't even flinch. The creatures around her tensed, reading the threat, but she held up one hand and they stilled. Tell him how you needed me gone because I saw too much, she said. And now her voice was low, dangerous. How you knew that eventually I'd mentioned to someone that I'd seen you in the vault when you were supposed to be at the eastern border. How I'd seen you meeting with Lord Vane's remaining son in the archive at midnight. How I'd noticed supplies disappearing from the armory and reappearing in shipments marked for your territories. Stop talking, Caspian snarled, advancing a step. Why? Elena asked, standing her ground. Afraid he'll finally see you for what you are? A coward who doesn't have the spine to challenge for the throne openly, so instead you've spent 15 years playing the loyal dog while sharpening your teeth in the dark? Caspian moved. Fast. Alpha fast. Blade cutting through the air toward Elena's throat with the kind of speed and precision that came from decades of combat training. The strike was perfect. Textbook, designed to sever the windpipe and carotid in one clean motion. But Elena was faster. She didn't dodge, didn't block. She caught his wrist mid-strike with her bare hand and stopped it cold. The sound of Caspian's momentum arresting was like a tree branch snapping under too much weight. His entire body jerked as physics fought biology and lost. His boots scraped on stone as he tried to continue the strike, but Elena's grip was absolute. Impossible. She was human. He was alpha. The strength differential should have been insurmountable. But down here in the dark, she'd become something else. "Here's what I learned down here," Elena said, her voice dropping to something that resonated in the bones and made the torchlight flicker. "Power isn't about bloodline or destiny or whatever pretty story you tell yourself. It's about adaptation, evolution, becoming what you need to be to survive. Your father understood that, Draven. That's why he built this place. He just didn't understand that the real weapon wasn't the creatures he created. It was what they could teach someone desperate enough to learn." She released Caspian's wrist and shoved him backward with enough force to send him stumbling. He caught himself against the chamber wall, shock and fear warring across his features. His wrist bore the imprint of her fingers, red marks already darkening to bruises. Draven finally found his voice. "Is it true? What's she saying?" Caspian's face went through a rapid series of expressions. Denial, calculation, a moment of genuine uncertainty where he seemed to be weighing options. And finally, resignation, the mask dropping away like a shed skin. "Does it matter?" he asked, and his voice had changed too. No more measured control, just flat honesty. "Does it matter?" Draven repeated, his voice dangerously quiet, the tone he'd used before ordering executions. "You were never going to hold this kingdom together," Caspian said, straightening to his full height. The pretense was gone now. No more loyal second, no more trusted advisor, just ambition wearing skin. "You're too soft, too sentimental. You want to reform a system that can only function through absolute dominance. You killed your father, but you're trying to build his empire with different rules, and it doesn't work that way. So you decided to take it from me." "I decided to save it from you," Caspian corrected, sheathing his blade in a gesture that was somehow more threatening than keeping it drawn. "The council sees it. The territories see it. You're strong, yes. Stronger than anyone except maybe your father was. But strength without ruthlessness is just violence waiting to be exploited. You have the power to rule, but not the will to do what ruling actually requires." "And what's that?" Draven asked, though he already knew the answer. "Everything," Caspian said. "Absolute commitment. The willingness to sacrifice anyone and anything to maintain order. Your father understood that. I understand that. You never did." Draven felt something cold settle in his chest, spreading outward like frost on glass. "How long?" "How long what? How long have you been planning this? The betrayal, the coup, all of it?" "Since the beginning," Caspian said, and there was something almost like pride in his voice now. "Since the day you took the throne and immediately started dismantling everything that made the kingdom strong. Merit over bloodline, justice over fear, compassion over control. You turned us from wolves into dogs, Draven, and dogs get put down by the first wolf that remembers its teeth. 15 years, Draven said, the words tasting like ash. 15 years you stood beside me, saved my life, bled with me, called me brother. And every second of it, I was building my own foundation, Caspian said. Every favor I did, every alliance I forged, every piece of information I gathered, it was all preparation. Because I knew eventually you'd make a mistake big enough that the council would accept a change in leadership. I just had to wait for the right opportunity. And then I handed it to you, Draven said. The girl. You handed me a perfect crisis, Caspian agreed. When I realized I could create evidence pointing to a conspiracy, I saw the opportunity. Frame someone with no connections, no protection, no ability to defend themselves. Force you into an impossible choice. Either defend her and look compromised, or sacrifice her and prove you're exactly like your father. A no-win scenario, Draven said. Elegant, wasn't it? Caspian smiled, and it was the smile of someone who just won a long game. If you'd protected her, the council would have moved against you for being controlled by a human. If you threw her away, which you did, you'd prove you were just as monstrous as the king you killed. Either way, your moral authority was destroyed. And the thefts are still happening because you're the one doing them. Obviously, Caspian said. How else was I going to fund a coup? Revolutions require resources, weapons, bribes, promises of advancement. None of that comes cheap. Draven's hand tightened on his blade. So this is it? This is where you make your move? No, Caspian said, and his smile widened. This is where you realize your move doesn't matter. The sound of boots on stone echoed from the passages behind them. Multiple sets. Heavy. Armed. Moving with military precision. Draven turned to see figures emerging from the shadows of the chamber's entrance. 20 alphas. Maybe more. All wearing the insignia of various territories and military units. All with weapons drawn and expressions carved from stone. All looking at him with the cold calculation of men who'd already chosen their side and committed to it. Caspian had brought an army. Did you really think I'd come down here without insurance? The second alpha asked, his voice rich with satisfaction. I've been planning this for 15 years. Every alpha in this room owes me more than they owe you. I've saved their careers, covered their mistakes, helped them advance. I've been there for them when you were too busy trying to reform the unreformable. You? You just demanded their loyalty because you wore a crown. Draven's mind was racing through options and finding them all blocked. 20 alphas between him and the exit. Trained fighters, loyal to Caspian. The second alpha at his back with 15 years of studied weaknesses. Elena and her creatures to the side, unpredictable variables who owed him nothing. He was trapped, cornered like an animal. Lord Vane stepped forward from the group of alphas. His silver hair pulled back tight enough to make his ancient face look skeletal. His eyes held the kind of satisfaction that comes from a long-anticipated revenge finally arriving. You lost, boy, the old alpha said, his voice carrying the weight of decades. The moment you killed my sons, you lost. It just took time for the debt to come due. So this is revenge, Draven said flatly. This is justice, Vane corrected, savoring each word. You took my children. Now I take your kingdom. Symmetry, balance, the old ways made manifest. And you, Draven said, looking back at Caspian, what do you get out of this arrangement? The throne, Caspian said simply, with the council's full blessing and support, a smooth transition of power. No civil war, no instability, just a recognition that the kingdom needs a different kind of leader. A more ruthless one, Draven said. A more realistic one, Caspian corrected. Someone who understands that empires aren't built on ideals and reform. They're built on fear and blood and the absolute certainty that challenge means death. Someone who won't hesitate when hard choices need to be made. The philosophy sounded familiar because it was. Draven's father had said almost the exact same thing the night before Draven killed him. Different king, same tyranny, the wheel turning but the road staying the same. You're making a mistake, Draven said, his voice low and steady despite the situation closing around him like a fist. Am I? Caspian gestured to the assembled alphas with theatrical flair. I have the council, I have the military command, I have the resources and the infrastructure. What do you have? The crown, Draven said. Not for long, Caspian replied, and pulled something from his coat. A scroll sealed with the council's mark. The vote was concluded 1 hour ago. Your abdication has been accepted. By the time we leave this chamber, you'll be a private citizen. At best. And at worst, Draven asked, though he already knew. At worst you resist, Caspian said, his voice going cold. Force us to kill you here in the dark where no one will ever find your body. Make this bloody and complicated and give us an excuse to purge anyone who might have been loyal to you. But either way, you're done. The only question is whether you leave here alive. Here's what nobody tells you about power when you're young and ambitious and certain you can change the world. It's not the having of it that destroys you. It's the losing of it. The moment when you realize that everything you built, everything you sacrificed for, everything you thought you controlled, it was never really yours. You were just holding it temporarily until someone stronger or smarter or more ruthless came along and took it. Draven was feeling that moment now. The weight of 20 years crashing down. The crown he'd killed his father to claim being stripped away by the same kind of calculated betrayal that had put it on his head in the first place. The cycle continuing. Endless. Inevitable. Unless he broke it. Draven looked at Elena. She stood perfectly still among her creatures, watching the whole scene unfold with those luminous eyes that saw too much and judged with inhuman clarity. "You wanted the truth," she said softly. "Now you have it. Question is, what are you going to do with it?" "What can I do?" Draven asked. The words tasted like defeat, like ash and old blood. "You can choose," Elena said. "For the first time in your reign, you can actually choose instead of just reacting to the choices other people force on you. You can be the king who holds on to power until it's ripped from your corpse. Or you can be the man who walks away and lives to fight another day." "There is no other day," Draven said. "Once I lose the crown—" "Who said anything about losing?" Elena's smile was sharp enough to cut. "You're thinking like a king, like power is a thing you hold in your hands. But I've learned something down here in the dark. Power isn't a crown or a throne or a title. It's what you become when everything else is stripped away." Draven looked around the chamber one more time. At Caspian, wearing his betrayal-like armor he'd been polishing for 15 years. At Vayne, savoring his revenge with the patience of someone who'd waited decades. At the 20 alphas who'd sold their loyalty for promises of advancement and position. At Elena and her creatures, transformed by the same system that was now consuming him. And he understood something fundamental. He'd spent 20 years trying to be different from his father while using his father's methods. Ruling through strength, through dominance, through the constant assertion that he was the apex predator who could never be challenged. But predators got old, got slow, got replaced by younger, hungrier things. It was inevitable. The system guaranteed it. Unless you stopped playing by the system's rules, unless you became something the system couldn't categorize or control. Draven looked at Caspian and made his choice. "I abdicate," he said. The words fell like stones into still water, creating ripples that spread across the chamber. "What?" Caspian's expression flickered with confusion, then suspicion. "This is a trick." "No trick," Draven said, and reached up to remove the simple circlet from his head. It was plain metal, unadorned, functional. His father's crown had been gold and gems and ostentation. Draven had melted that monstrosity down the day after his coronation and used the metal for medical supplies and infrastructure. He held the circlet out to Caspian. "Take it. I abdicate. Right here, right now, in front of witnesses. You want the throne? It's yours." "I'm done." Caspian stared at the offered crown like it might be a serpent coiled to strike. "You're trying to— To what?" Draven interrupted. "Buy time?" "There is no time. You've already won. The council's voted. The military's compromised. I have no allies in this room, no resources, no path to victory. So I'm choosing the one thing you didn't account for in your 15 years of planning. Which is what?" "Surrender," Draven said, and tossed the crown to Caspian. The second alpha caught it reflexively, his hands closing around the metal. The chamber fell silent except for the distant drip of water and the breathing of creatures in the dark and the sound of 20 alphas trying to process what had just happened. "This doesn't change anything," Caspian said, but there was uncertainty in his voice now, confusion at a script that had gone off course. "You still know too much. You're still a threat. You could rally supporters, cause problems. Then kill me," Draven said, spreading his arms wide. "Add it to the list of things you've done. One more body, one more betrayal, one more piece of evidence that you're exactly what you accused me of being, but do it yourself. Don't hide behind your soldiers. Don't make them carry the weight of your ambition. If you're going to be king, act like one." Caspian's hand tightened on his blade. The moment stretched, taut as a drawn bowstring. Then Vayne laughed. The sound was like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Sharp, sudden, mirthless. "Let him go," the old alpha said, his voice rich with satisfaction. "Let him walk out of here and live with what he's lost. Death would be mercy. Let him spend the rest of his days knowing he failed, that everything he tried to build collapsed because he was too weak to hold it. That's a better revenge than a quick death could ever be." Draven met Vayne's gaze, saw the decades of hatred there, the grief for dead sons that had calcified into something harder and colder. "You'll never have your sons back," he said quietly. "Crown or no crown, coup or no coup, that doesn't change. They're still dead, and killing me won't bring them back." Vane's smile was a wound across his face. No, but I have your kingdom now. I have your legacy. I have everything you built, and I'm going to watch it be dismantled piece by piece. That's enough. The Alphas parted, creating a corridor to the exit, a path lined with the men who'd chosen to betray him. Draven looked at Elena one last time. She sat back down on her altar, surrounded by monsters, completely at ease in the darkness that would have broken anyone else. I'm sorry, he said, for what I did, for what I let them do, for all of it. Sorry. Doesn't fix anything, Elena said, but her voice had lost some of its edge. But at least you finally said it. That's more than most kings would do. What will you do now? Survive, Elena said. Adapt, same as always. The question is, what will you do? Where does a king go when he's not a king anymore? Draven looked down at his empty hands, hands that had held a crown, held a blade, held power that could shatter armies and remake territories. Now they held nothing. Learn, he said. For the first time in my life, actually learn instead of just ruling. Figure out what comes next when the only thing you've ever known is torn away. Good luck with that, Elena said, and there might have been genuine sympathy in her voice. Draven walked toward the exit, each step feeling like shedding weight he'd been carrying so long he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand upright. The crown, the throne, the constant pressure of maintaining dominance, the endless calculation of threats and counters, all of it falling away. The Alphas watched him pass with expressions ranging from contempt to satisfaction to something that might have been pity. He was no longer a king, no longer a threat, no longer anything that mattered in their world of hierarchy and dominance. Just a man. He'd almost reached the archway when Elena's voice stopped him one final time. Draven. He turned. The girl they threw away didn't die down here, Elena said, her luminous eyes reflecting the torchlight like mirrors. She became something they couldn't control, something they couldn't categorize or contain. Remember that, when you're out there learning, when you're trying to figure out what comes next. The system didn't destroy me. It transformed me, and transformation is contagious. The creatures around her stirred, as if responding to her words, as if they understood what she was really saying. Evolution doesn't ask permission. It just happens, and you can either adapt or die. Draven nodded once, a gesture of acknowledgement, of understanding. Then he walked out of the chamber, out of the pits, out of the palace that had been his prison, disguised as power for 20 years. Behind him, Caspian stood holding the crown, staring at it like it might suddenly make sense if he looked at it long enough. And Elena sat among her monsters, waiting, because transformation takes time, and she had nothing but time now. The kingdom was changing whether it wanted to or not, and the thing about change, it's never comfortable. It's never clean. It's always bloody. Always. 3 months passed like water through broken hands. Draven learned what it meant to be nothing. He walked out of Ashenmoor with the clothes on his back, a blade at his hip, and a wound in his chest that had nothing to do with steel. No guards, no resources, no name that carried weight beyond the mountain shadow where Caspian's new regime held absolute power. The first week, he expected assassins. They never came. Caspian was smarter than that, smarter than Draven had given him credit for, which was saying something after 15 years of watching the man operate in the shadows while pretending to bask in loyalty's light. Dead martyrs inspired rebellion. Songs. Legends about kings who were murdered by usurpers and needed to be avenged by the righteous. But broken kings wandering the wasteland like beggars? Broken kings who'd given up their crown without a fight? That inspired pity. And pity was poison to a legacy, worse than poison. Pity was erasure. So Draven wandered. He moved through the outer territories like a ghost, taking work where he could find it. Manual labor mostly. The kind that destroyed your back and paid barely enough to keep breathing. Loading cargo at trade posts where merchants looked through him like he was invisible. Repairing stone walls for farmers who treated him like he was simple. Speaking slowly and loudly as if volume could compensate for assumed stupidity. Digging irrigation ditches in heat that made his vision swim and his hands bleed through calluses that had forgotten what real work felt like. Nobody recognized him. Why would they? Kings existed in palaces, distant and untouchable as stars. They wore fine clothes and commanded armies, and spoke in pronouncements that shaped the lives of thousands. The man with calloused hands and dust ground permanently into his skin, and scars that hadn't come from palace intrigue couldn't possibly be the Alpha who'd ruled an empire for 20 years. The man who slept in barns and ate whatever scraps he could afford and moved from place to place like tumbleweed couldn't be the same person who'd sat on the obsidian throne and held the power of life and death over millions. The disconnect was absolute. And in that disconnect, Draven found something he'd never had as king: freedom to see, to really see what the empire looked like from the bottom. And it was uglier than he'd imagined. He tried to reform it from the top, implemented policies designed to ease the burden on the territories, reduced taxation, increased infrastructure investment, created merit-based advancement to break the stranglehold of the old bloodlines. But none of it had reached the people who actually needed it. The reforms had been filtered through layers of bureaucracy and self-interest until they emerged toothless and ineffective. The tax reduction had been offset by new fees invented by local administrators. The infrastructure investment had been siphoned into projects that benefited the wealthy. The merit-based advancement had become another currency for corruption, with positions sold to the highest bidder rather than earned. The system had absorbed his reforms like a body absorbing and neutralizing poison, adapting, surviving, remaining fundamentally unchanged. And slowly, stripped of everything that had defined him, Draven started to understand what Elena had meant about transformation. He'd spent 2 decades viewing power as something external, a crown you wore, a throne you sat on, an empire that bent to your will through force and the constant assertion of dominance and the threat of violence for those who challenged you. But power wasn't external. It was what remained when everything else was stripped away. Your will, your adaptability, your absolute refusal to break even when breaking would be so much easier than continuing to stand. Your ability to see the world as it actually was, rather than how you wished it to be. He learned to listen instead of command, learned to observe instead of dominate, learned that the people at the bottom of the hierarchy saw everything the people at the top were too blind or too arrogant to notice. He listened to the laborers talking about how the new king had tripled taxation in the border territories, claiming it was necessary for defense, but using it to fund private armies loyal only to him. He watched local alphas abuse their authority with impunity, knowing Caspian's regime would support them as long as the tribute flowed upward. He saw villages going hungry while grain rotted in warehouses, held back from market to drive up prices for those who controlled the supply. The empire was eating itself. Caspian wasn't maintaining what Draven had built. He was strip mining it, extracting everything of value as quickly as possible to consolidate personal power before the whole structure collapsed under its own corruption. It was his father's way perfected, the way that had led to rebellion and civil war, and eventually to Draven killing the old king and trying to build something different. History repeating in an accelerating spiral because the people in power never learned, never wanted to learn. Change threatened their position, so they crushed it and called it stability. But Draven was learning something new. You couldn't change a system from the top down. The weight of tradition and self-interest was too heavy, too entrenched in every level of the hierarchy. The moment you looked away, everything reverted to the old patterns like water flowing downhill, following the path of least resistance back to tyranny. Real change had to come from below, from the people who had nothing to lose because everything had already been taken from them, from those who understood that the system was designed to keep them powerless and were desperate enough to risk everything to shatter it. But it required a catalyst, something or someone to unite the scattered resentment and suffering into focused action, something to make people believe that change was possible. Draven was contemplating this in a border town tavern called The Broken Wheel, nursing cheap whiskey that tasted like regret, and watching local alpha enforcers shake down a merchant who couldn't afford to resist but couldn't afford to pay either when the rumors started. They came with traders and refugees flowing out of the capital territories, whispered over drinks, shared in corners where the enforcers couldn't overhear, about something emerging from the pits beneath Ashenmoor, about creatures walking the palace corridors at night, leaving guards drained of life like empty vessels, their eyes open but hollow, about whole sections of the lower levels being sealed off completely, barricaded with steel and wards, and the kind of defensive measures that spoke of genuine fear, about a girl who'd been thrown away and had become something else, something that was getting stronger every day. The new king had tripled the guards on the pit entrances, the rumors said, forbidden anyone from descending past level 3 on pain of immediate execution. Brought in alchemists and mages from across the empire to reinforce the wards and seals that were supposed to contain whatever was down there. But the things in the deep were still getting out. Not through force or violence, through patience and intelligence. Through the slow, methodical exploitation of every weakness in the barriers that had never been designed to hold something that understood them from the inside. Something that had human intelligence combined with inhuman capabilities. Bodies were being found every few days. Guards mostly. Sometimes servants who'd been in the wrong place at the wrong time. All of them empty. Drained of something essential that left them alive in the technical sense, but absent in every way that mattered. Caspian had put a blackout on information coming out of the palace, the rumors said. But you couldn't hide that kind of fear. It leaked out through the cracks, through servants who fled in the night, through guards who deserted rather than face another shift in the lower levels. Through the way the new king had started sleeping in a different room every night, protected by a rotating guard of his most trusted alphas. Through the way he looked over his shoulder constantly, like something was stalking him. Draven paid his tab with the last of his coin and left the tavern as the sun set blood red over the mountains. He'd been running from his failure for 3 months, learning, watching, understanding. Time to run toward it instead, time to see what his failure had created. The journey back to Ashenmoor took 2 weeks on foot through terrain he'd once commanded from maps and reports, now experiencing it at ground level where the reality of imperial policy became visceral. He moved through villages struggling under Caspian's increased taxation, past farms that had been abandoned when the owners couldn't pay the tribute and had their land seized, saw border outposts undermanned and undersupplied because resources were being funneled to the capital and Caspian's private armies, instead of the actual defense infrastructure. Everything Draven had tried to prevent was happening at accelerated speed. The outer territories were withering while the center gorged itself. The pattern was ancient, inevitable. The way empires always died, from the edges inward, collapsing under the weight of their own extraction until there was nothing left to extract and the whole structure imploded. Caspian was accelerating the process, but he hadn't invented it. It was built into the system itself, into the very concept of empire as domination and resource extraction. You couldn't reform that. You could only replace it with something fundamentally different. Ashenmoor rose before him on the 13th day like a black fang against the dying light. The palace looked different somehow, darker, like the shadows had grown substance and weight, like the whole mountain was holding its breath in anticipation of something terrible. Waiting. The air around the citadel felt wrong, oppressive, like the pressure before a storm that would break the world. Draven didn't approach the main gates. Those would be watched by alphas loyal to Caspian, men who'd been given orders to kill the former king on sight if he was stupid enough to return. Men who would take pleasure in the task, proving their loyalty to the new regime by destroying what remained of the old. Instead, he circled to the eastern cliff face where the mountain's natural caves connected to the palace's lower foundations through passages that predated the citadel itself. Secret routes his father had used for smuggling and disposing of bodies that asked too many questions or knew too many secrets. Passages Draven had sealed when he took the throne, believing that transparency was strength and secrets were the cancer that rotted empires from within. The seals were broken now, shattered from the inside with the kind of force that spoke of inhuman strength. Someone, or something, had been using these tunnels regularly. The stone around the entrance was scored with claw marks that cut deep into solid rock. Draven drew his blade and descended into the dark, every sense heightened, every instinct screaming that he was walking into a predator's territory. The passages were exactly as he remembered, narrow enough that his shoulders brushed stone on both sides, twisting like intestines through the mountain's guts, following the natural fault lines and fissures, carved wider by prisoners who died in the making, their bones still visible in the walls where the stone had collapsed and been rebuilt around them, preserved forever in their final agony. The air was thick and stale, untouched by wind for decades. It tasted of minerals and old death and something else now. Something organic and fundamentally wrong that made his alpha instincts flare with warning. He moved by memory and the dim phosphorescent glow of fungus that had never seen sunlight, one hand on the rough stone wall for guidance, blade ready in the other. The tunnel opened into the sub-basement levels below the palace proper. Storage chambers filled with forgotten equipment and supplies covered in dust thick as funeral shrouds. Crates of materials from construction projects decades past. Weapons from wars that had ended before Draven was born. The accumulated detritus of an empire that never threw anything away because waste was weakness. And blood, fresh blood, dark pools of it spreading across stone floors that hadn't been walked on in years. Drag marks leading toward the deeper levels, toward the pits. The kind of scene that told a story even if you didn't want to read it. Someone had been taken down here. Recently. Screaming and bleeding and already knowing they were dead. Draven followed the trail through the maze of abandoned rooms, his breathing controlled, his footsteps silent from decades of combat training. He moved like the predator he'd been before the crown had made him think he was something more than that. He heard them before he saw them. Voices. Low. Urgent. Threaded with the kind of fear that alpha conditioning was supposed to eliminate through childhood training and genetic predisposition. He pressed against the wall and looked around the corner into a wider corridor lit by torches that burned with chemical fire. 5 guards. All alphas. Recognizable by the way they moved and the quality of their weapons and the way they held themselves despite the fear radiating off them, like heat. All armed with blades treated with silver and alchemical compounds that burned with cold fire, designed to hurt things that normal steel couldn't touch. All looking terrified as they stood watch over a massive iron door, sealed with chains and warding symbols that pulsed with dying light, the magic draining away faster than it could be replenished. One of them was shaking, visibly trembling despite decades of training that was supposed to make such displays of weakness impossible. His hands couldn't keep still on his weapon. "It's getting worse every night," the guard whispered, his voice cracking like breaking glass. "They get closer. They get bolder. Jensen was found yesterday. Kroll the day before. Both of them just empty. Like something drank them dry and left the shells behind as a message." "The new king says hold position," another guard said, but there was no conviction in his voice, just hollow repetition of orders that felt increasingly meaningless. "Says reinforcements are coming. Says the mages are working on new wards." "Reinforcements," a third guard laughed, bitter and raw and close to hysteria. "What good are reinforcements against things that used to be human? Things that know how we think because they used to think the same way. Things that are getting smarter every day." "We should run," the youngest guard suggested, and there was naked pleading in his voice. His eyes were too wide, too white, too aware of his own mortality. "Just leave. Abandon our posts. Head for the Eastern Territories and never look back. Let someone else deal with this nightmare." "And go where?" The first guard's voice rose slightly before he caught himself and dropped it to a harsh whisper, aware that sound carried in these stone corridors. "You think anywhere is safe from what's down there? You think distance matters to things that can track you by the scent of your fear? They'll find us. They'll find everyone who was part of throwing that girl into the pits." "She was just a servant," the young guard protested weakly. "She was human," the first guard said, "and we threw her to the monsters. Now she's become something worse than anything that was already down there." "Maybe they can't get through the door," someone said without conviction. "That's what they said about the last 3 doors," came the reply. "About the seals on level 6. About the wards on level 5. All of them failed. All of them." The door behind them buckled. Not violently, not with the crash of something trying to break through by brute force. Just a subtle warping. Like the metal itself was tired of resisting. Like the molecular bonds were being gently, patiently convinced to let go. Like someone was explaining to the steel why it should fail, and the steel was listening. The guards scrambled back, weapons raised, the cold fire of their blades casting shifting shadows that made the corridor seem alive. The door held. Barely. The metal groaning with stress. But they all heard it. The sound from the other side. Breathing. Slow, deliberate, patient as erosion wearing down mountains. The sound of something that knew it didn't need to rush. That had all the time in the world. That understood that eventually, inevitably, every barrier failed and every defense crumbled and every guard's courage broke. That it was only a matter of time. Draven watched the guards for another moment, reading their body language with the skill of someone who'd commanded armies. They were close to breaking. maybe hours away, maybe less. The fear was eating them from inside, and fear was contagious. Once one ran, they'd all run. And then nothing would stand between whatever Elena had become and the palace above. He moved past them through a parallel corridor, using the servant passages he'd memorized during his reign. The routes designed for people who were supposed to be invisible. The paths that let you move through the palace unseen, carrying food and laundry and messages and never being noticed by those above. He knew these levels, knew the ways around the sealed doors and official checkpoints, knew the forgotten stairs and hidden passages that connected the palace's various functions, knew how to get to the pits without triggering the alarms that would bring Caspian's entire force down on him. The deeper he went, the warmer it got. The air taking on that thick mineral quality he remembered from his descent with Caspian 3 months ago. Humidity that made every breath feel like swallowing soup, heat that spoke of geothermal vents and volcanic activity far below. Had that descent only been 3 months ago? It felt like years, like a different lifetime, like something that had happened to someone else. Level 5 was abandoned. The cells standing empty with their doors hanging open like mouths frozen mid-scream. The torches extinguished. Only the phosphorescent fungus provided light, painting everything in shades of sickly green that made the shadows move wrong, made distances hard to judge, made everything feel slightly unreal. The walls were covered in scratch marks, deep gouges that hadn't been there 3 months ago. Something had been sharpening its claws on the stone. Level 6 showed signs of recent occupation and rapid abandonment. Food wrappers scattered across the floor. Water skins left behind in the rush to evacuate. Bloodstains that tracked toward the stairs leading up, painted in patterns that suggested people running while wounded, bleeding as they fled. Evidence that guards had been stationed here and retreated higher when whatever was below got too close, when the fear became too much, when orders stopped mattering compared to survival. The experimental labs were destroyed, equipment smashed beyond recognition or repair, tables overturned with such force they'd cracked, glass everywhere, crunching under his boots like snow, beakers and vials and instruments scattered in testament to violence or deliberate demolition. The walls were covered in new scratches that formed patterns, almost like language, almost like warnings or instructions written in a script that predated words. Symbols that made his eyes hurt to follow, that suggested meaning just beyond his ability to comprehend. Draven reached level 7 and stopped at the threshold, his breath catching. The chamber where he'd last seen Elena was transformed into something that barely resembled the space he remembered. The altar at the center was covered in something organic, living tissue that pulsed with bioluminescent light in patterns that suggested a heartbeat. Veins of the stuff spread across the floor and up the walls like roots seeking purchase, glowing in synchronized rhythm with the central mass. The whole structure breathed, expanding and contracting with disturbing regularity. The walls themselves were lined with cocoon-like structures, dozens of them. Some empty, their contents already emerged and gone. Others still occupied by shapes that were changing, shifting, evolving into configurations that made his eyes hurt to track, that violated the fundamental rules of anatomy and biology. The whole chamber breathed, in and out, like a lung, like a womb, growing something. And sitting in the middle of it all, exactly where he'd left her 3 months ago, surrounded by her creations, Elena. She looked up as he entered, and Draven saw that the transformation had accelerated far beyond what he'd imagined possible. Her eyes were fully luminous now, glowing with their own light in colors that didn't quite exist in the normal spectrum, colors his brain couldn't properly process. Her skin had taken on an opalescent quality that made it hard to focus on her directly, like looking at something underwater or through heat shimmer. Her hair moved independent of gravity or air current, drifting around her face like she was submerged in invisible fluid, each strand seeming to have independent life. Her hands, when she gestured, left after images in the air, trails of light that persisted for seconds before fading. But her expression was still recognizably human, still recognizably her, still carrying the weight of betrayal and abandonment and everything that had been done to her. "You came back," she said. Her voice resonated in frequencies that made his bones ache and his teeth feel loose in their sockets, made his heart skip beats, made reality feel slightly unstable. "I wasn't sure you would. Wasn't sure you had the courage." I needed to see what you'd become, Draven said, keeping his blade sheathed despite every instinct screaming at him to draw it. A gesture of trust or foolishness. He wasn't entirely sure which. Maybe both. And? Elena stood in one fluid motion, graceful and entirely wrong in ways that made every predator instinct he possessed scream warnings his conscious mind couldn't fully articulate. What do you see, my former king? Draven looked around the chamber with eyes that had seen battlefields and throne rooms, and the private torture chambers his father had maintained. At the creatures emerging from their cocoons, some still vaguely human-shaped, others gone too far down strange evolutionary paths to recognize as anything that had ever walked the earth. At Mother standing guard near the entrance, more transformed than before, barely recognizable as anything that had ever possessed human form. At the organic growth covering every surface, pulsing with alien life that responded to Elena's presence like flowers tracking the sun. Evolution, he said finally, the word inadequate, but the only one that fit. Adaptation, transformation. Everything you said you'd become, and more. Not just me, Elena gestured to encompass the chamber and everything in it. All of us. Everyone your father tried to destroy. Everyone the system threw away because we were inconvenient or weak or just in the wrong place when someone needed a scapegoat. We're changing down here. Becoming something that can't be contained anymore. Something that can't be forgotten or erased or sealed behind iron doors and magic wards. She smiled, and it was terrible. Something that's coming for the people who created us. Here's the truth about survival that nobody wants to admit. It changes you, not just physically, though that happens too, but fundamentally, at the level of who you are and what you believe and what you're willing to do to keep existing. You can't go through hell and come out the same person who went in. You either break and die, or you adapt and become something else entirely. Something harder, colder, more willing to do whatever it takes to ensure you're never vulnerable again. Elena had survived, and in surviving she'd become something that terrified even alphas. Draven stood in that transformed chamber, surrounded by creatures that had once been human, facing a girl who'd been thrown away and had become a force of nature, and understood with perfect clarity that everything came down to this moment. 3 months, he said. You promised me 3 months. I promised you'd have time to try, Elena corrected. I never promised I'd wait if the opportunity presented itself sooner. And look at you, Draven, standing here in my domain, alone, unarmed in any way that matters. You've delivered yourself to me like a gift. The creatures around her shifted, reading her tone, responding to the predatory edge in her voice. Mother moved closer, positioned to strike if Elena gave the command. I came because we need to talk, Draven said, about what happens next, about whether you're going to become exactly what they made you or something better. Better, Elena repeated and laughed. The sound echoed off stone walls that pulsed with organic growth. Tell me, what's better than survival? What's better than ensuring that what happened to me never happens to anyone else? Revenge isn't prevention, Draven said. Burning the Empire to ash won't stop the next empire from rising. It'll just reset the cycle. New tyrants, new victims, same patterns with different names. Then what do you suggest? Elena's eyes blazed brighter, the bioluminescence intensifying. More reform from the top? More well-intentioned policies that get strangled by the same system you're trying to change? How did that work for you, my king? Oh wait, you're not king anymore. You're just a man who learned too late that you can't fix something that's fundamentally broken. You're right, Draven said, and saw surprise flicker across her transformed features. I can't fix it from the top. I tried for 20 years and failed. The system is too entrenched, too self-preserving. It adapts to threats and neutralizes them. So you agree, Elena said. It needs to burn. No, Draven replied. I agree it needs to be replaced. But there's a difference between destruction for revenge and destruction that builds something better from the ashes. One is just violence. The other is revolution. Elena tilted her head, studying him with those inhuman eyes that saw too much. And what makes you think you can build something better? You had unlimited power and failed. Because I was trying to work within the system, Draven said, trying to reform it without understanding that the system itself was the problem. But I've spent 3 months at the bottom now, seeing how the Empire actually functions for the people it's supposed to serve. seen how every reform gets twisted, how every good intention gets corrupted, how the weight of hierarchy crushes everything beneath it. So you've learned to see, Elena said. Congratulations. That doesn't change what needs to happen. It changes how it happens, Draven countered. You can tear down the palace and kill everyone inside, slaughter the council and the alphas and everyone who benefited from the system. And you know what? You'd be justified. Every single one of them is complicit in what happened to you and thousands like you. But then what? Elena asked. Then you have a power vacuum, Draven said. And power vacuums get filled by whoever is strong enough and ruthless enough to claim them. Someone like Caspian. Or worse. And the whole cycle begins again because you destroyed the structure, but not the conditions that created it. The chamber fell silent except for the pulsing of organic growth and the breathing of creatures and the distant drip of water somewhere in the deep. Elena stood perfectly still, processing his words with an intelligence that had been sharpened by suffering into something razor-edged. What are you proposing? She asked finally. Partnership, Draven said. You have the power to destroy. I have the knowledge of how the system works and what needs to replace it. Together, we could actually build something new instead of just burning down the old. You want me to trust you, Elena said flatly. The man who threw me into this pit, who sacrificed me to save his throne, who chose his crown over my life. That man wants me to trust him. No, Draven said. I want you to use me. I'm not asking for trust or forgiveness or redemption. I'm offering you a tool, someone who knows the Empire's weaknesses, who understands the logistics of revolution, who can help you build something that lasts instead of just satisfying your rage. Elena moved closer, and the air pressure changed around her, reality bending slightly in response to whatever she'd become. And what do you get out of this arrangement? A chance to actually fix what I broke, Draven said. A chance to prove that change is possible without returning to tyranny. A chance to show that the system can be replaced with something that values people as people instead of resources to be extracted. Pretty words, Elena said. But I've learned that words are cheap. Actions matter, choices matter. So tell me, Draven, what are you willing to sacrifice to prove you mean what you say? Everything, Draven said without hesitation. I've already lost my crown, my throne, my empire. I have nothing left except the knowledge of how I failed and the determination not to fail the same way twice. Everyone has something left, Elena said, something they're not willing to lose. What's yours? My life, Draven said. If this doesn't work, if we build something and it turns into the same tyranny with a different face, you kill me. Publicly. As a warning that even revolutionaries can become tyrants. Elena studied him for a long moment, her transformed face unreadable. You're serious, she said. Completely. Why? Because I owe you, Draven said, and the words came from somewhere deep, somewhere that had been carved hollow by 3 months of wandering and 20 years of failing to be better than his father. I owe you for throwing you away when you were innocent. I owe you for choosing political expediency over justice. I owe you for every person who suffered because I wasn't strong enough to break the system instead of trying to work within it. Debt doesn't rebuild empires, Elena said. No, Draven agreed. But it can motivate people to try harder than they've ever tried before. It can turn failure into fuel. And right now, I'm carrying enough failure to power a revolution. Here's what most people don't understand about power. It's not about domination. It's not about forcing others to submit to your will. Real power, the kind that lasts, the kind that changes things, comes from giving people something worth believing in. A vision of what could be instead of what is. A reason to risk everything for the possibility of something better. Draven had spent 20 years trying to impose change from above, using the authority of his position to mandate reform. And it had failed because you can't force people to change what they believe. You can only show them something worth changing for. Elena represented destruction, the wrath of everyone the system had discarded. But destruction alone wouldn't build what came next. For that, you needed vision, strategy, the patient work of construction that was harder and slower and less satisfying than burning everything down. The boots were louder now, closer. The guards had finally worked up the courage to investigate what was happening in the deep levels. You need to decide, Draven said. Now. Do you want revenge or revolution? Can't I have both? Elena asked, and there was something almost playful in her tone. Something that reminded him she was still young beneath all the transformation, still carrying the weight of 12 years of invisible servitude before everything shattered. Maybe, Draven said, but one serves you. The other serves everyone who comes after. Choose wisely. Elena looked around her chamber, at the creatures she'd awakened and nurtured, at the organic growth that represented her transformation, at everything she'd become in the dark. Then she looked at Draven. 3 months, she said. You had 3 months to prove change was possible. Show me what you've accomplished. Draven reached into his coat and pulled out a rolled parchment, worn and stained from 3 months of carrying it through the wasteland. I've been to 43 villages in the Outer Territories, he said. Talked to over 2,000 people. Laborers, farmers, merchants, servants, soldiers who deserted Caspian's armies. Everyone the Empire has ground down and discarded. And I asked them one question. If you could build a new system from nothing, what would it look like? He unrolled the parchment. It was covered in writing, hundreds of different hands, different inks, different languages and dialects. This is what they said, Draven continued. No kings, no hereditary nobility, no hierarchy based on strength or bloodline. Instead, councils elected from each community, resources distributed based on need instead of power, justice administered by peers instead of appointed alphas. Work valued equally whether it's physical labor or intellectual effort. That's a fantasy, Elena said. People don't work that way. The strong will always dominate the weak. Maybe, Draven said. Or maybe that only happens because the system is designed to reward domination. What if we designed it to reward cooperation instead? What if we built structures that made exploitation harder than collaboration? You're talking about completely dismantling everything, Elena said. Yes, Draven agreed. Everything. The throne, the council, the territorial system, the whole hierarchy. All of it replaced with something that starts from the premise that people have value beyond their ability to serve those above them. Elena took the parchment from him. Read through the signatures and proposals with those luminous eyes. These people will be crushed the moment Caspian hears about this, she said. They're marking themselves for execution. Only if we let that happen, Draven said. Only if we don't move first. You want to start a war? Elena said. I want to start a revolution, Draven corrected. Wars are about power changing hands. Revolutions are about power structures being replaced. There's a difference. The guards burst into the chamber with weapons drawn and torches raised. 20 alphas in full combat gear, led by a commander whose face went pale when he saw Elena surrounded by her creatures. Stand down, the commander ordered, his voice cracking slightly. The king wants them alive. The king, Elena repeated, and smiled that terrible smile. Tell me, which king? The one cowering in the palace above, or the one standing here offering me revolution? The commander's eyes flicked to Draven, recognition dawning with visible shock. Draven Kalor, he breathed. You're supposed to be gone, Draven finished. Vanished. Erased from history. I know, Caspian did a thorough job of writing me out of the narrative. But here's the thing about ghosts. We have a habit of returning when least expected. You're under arrest, the commander said, but there was no conviction in his voice. Both of you. By order of King Caspian, you're to be taken into custody and what? Elena interrupted. Executed? Thrown back into the pits? Made examples of? We've already been through that. It didn't work out well for anyone involved. She gestured, and the creatures moved. Not attacking, just positioning themselves between the guards and Elena and Draven, creating a living barrier of transformed flesh and alien biology. Here's what's going to happen, Elena said, and her voice carried the weight of absolute certainty. You're going to go back to Caspian. You're going to tell him that the pits are no longer under his control, that everything down here belongs to me now, and that if he wants to negotiate, he does it on my terms. He'll kill you, the commander said. He'll bring the entire army down here and burn it all. Let him try, Elena said. Let him send his armies into the dark to face things that were created by his predecessor's cruelty and perfected by his own. Let him learn what happens when you treat people as disposable and they decide to dispose of you instead. The commander looked at his men, saw the fear in their faces, the way they gripped their weapons too tight, the way they kept glancing at the creatures and at Elena and at the organic growth that seemed to pulse faster in response to the tension. He was smart enough to recognize a losing position when he saw one. We'll deliver your message, he said. Good, Elena replied. Now leave before I change my mind about letting you. The guards retreated, moving backward with weapons still raised, not turning their backs until they were through the archway and into the passage beyond. Then they ran, the sound of their boots echoing through the stone corridors like thunder, fading into distance. Elena turned to Draven. That bought us time, she said. Maybe a day, maybe less. Caspian will move fast once he knows you're here, once he realizes this isn't just about me anymore. Then we move faster, Draven said. We take what we've built and we weaponize it. Every person who signed that parchment, every village that's suffering under Caspian's taxation, every soldier who's sick of serving a tyrant, we bring them together and we show them that change is possible. How? Elena asked. Caspian has the military, the resources, the infrastructure. We have angry villagers and creatures from the pits. That's not an army. It's not about armies, Draven said. It's about legitimacy. Right now, Caspian holds the throne because people believe he has the right to hold it. Because the system says whoever has the crown makes the rules. We break that belief. We show people that the crown is meaningless, that power comes from their consent, not from force. You're talking about propaganda, Elena said. I'm talking about truth, Draven corrected. The truth that empires only exist because the people at the bottom agree to hold up the people at the top. And the moment they stop agreeing, the whole structure collapses. Elena considered this, her transformed mind processing implications and strategies at inhuman speed. We'd need to move simultaneously, she said. Hit multiple targets at once. Overwhelm Caspian's ability to respond. Force him to choose between protecting the palace and protecting the territories. Exactly, Draven said. And I know which he'll choose. He'll protect the palace because that's where his power is concentrated, which means the territories will be open. And that's where we build, Elena finished, seeing the full picture now. We don't try to take the throne. We make it irrelevant. We build the new system in the spaces the old system abandons. Now you're thinking like a revolutionary, Draven said. The next 24 hours moved like wildfire through dry grass. Draven and Elena emerged from the pits together, flanked by creatures that made the palace guards flee in terror. They moved through the lower levels, leaving sealed doors open behind them, releasing everything that Caspian had tried to contain. Not to attack, not yet. Just to be seen, to show the palace staff and guards and administrators that the monsters were loose and the new king couldn't protect them. Fear was a weapon, and Elena wielded it with surgical precision. While the palace descended into panic, Draven moved through the servant quarters and guard barracks, talking to people who'd been invisible under the old regime and were still invisible under the new one. People who had nothing to gain from Caspian's rule and everything to lose. He showed them the parchment, the signatures, the vision of something different, and he asked them one question: are you willing to fight for it? Most said yes. Some said nothing, but their eyes said yes. A few said no, and Draven let them go. Revolution couldn't be forced. It had to be chosen. By dawn, half the palace staff had vanished, slipping away through the same secret passages Draven had used to enter, carrying messages to the territories, spreading the word that change was coming and the time to choose sides was now. Caspian woke to find his palace half empty and the pits unsealed. He called an emergency council meeting in the throne room, but only 3 of the 7 elders appeared. The others had fled during the night, reading the situation with the survival instinct that had kept them alive through multiple regime changes. Lord Vane was among those who fled. Revenge, apparently, had limits when faced with genuine threat. Caspian sat on the throne Draven had abdicated, wearing the crown Draven had tossed to him, and realized with growing horror that he'd made a fundamental miscalculation. He'd thought removing Draven would solve his problems. Instead, he'd created something worse, a martyr with nothing to lose and everything to prove. The throne room doors opened. Draven walked in, flanked by Elena and Mother, trailed by a dozen creatures that had once been human and were now something that made alphas back away. Caspian stood, hand on his blade, the 3 remaining elders moving to defensive positions. "You can't be here," Caspian said. "You abdicated. You gave up your claim. The throne is mine by council decree." "I'm not here for the throne," Draven said, his voice carrying through the chamber with the authority of someone who'd commanded from this room for 20 years. "I'm here to tell you it doesn't matter anymore." "Everything matters," Caspian snarled. "I won. I outplayed you. I took everything you built and made it mine. You took a building, Draven said. Stone and gold and empty symbols. But you lost the empire. The territories are in open revolt. The guards are deserting. The servants have vanished. You're king of a palace that's crumbling around you. I have armies, Caspian said, that are scattered across the territories trying to suppress rebellions that are springing up faster than they can respond, Draven countered. That are asking themselves why they're fighting for a king who hoards resources while they starve, that are starting to realize they have more in common with the rebels than with you. Lies, Caspian said, but there was desperation in his voice now. Truth, Elena said, stepping forward. We've spent 3 months building what you spent 3 months destroying, and the difference is what we built doesn't depend on crowns or thrones or the threat of violence. It depends on people choosing something better. This is treason, one of the elders said. This is revolution, Draven corrected. And you can either join it or be swept away by it. The elder looked at Caspian, at the creatures, at the empty chamber where dozens of alphas should have been standing guard. Then he removed his council insignia and placed it on the floor. I'm too old for this, he said. Let the young decide what comes next. He walked out. The other 2 elders looked at each other, then followed, leaving Caspian alone with Draven and Elena and the monsters. So this is how it ends, Caspian said. Not with battle, not with honor, just abandonment. This is how tyranny always ends, Draven said. Everyone who supported it realizes the cost is too high and walks away. You're not a king, Caspian. You're just a man sitting in a chair holding a piece of metal, commanding people who aren't listening anymore. I could kill you, Caspian said. Right here, right now. You could try, Elena said. But then what? You'd still be alone in a crumbling palace? Still facing rebellions you can't suppress? Still watching everything slip through your fingers? What do you want? Caspian asked, and the crown on his head suddenly looked like a burden instead of a prize. Your abdication, Draven said, publicly, in front of whatever witnesses we can gather, admitting that the old system failed and something new is being built. And if I refuse, then we leave you here, Elena said, alone. And you can watch as the empire you stole tears itself apart and eventually comes for you. How long do you think you'll last when the food runs out, when the guards don't return, when the territories stop sending tribute? Caspian stared at the crown in his hands. Everything he'd plotted for, everything he'd betrayed Draven to claim, and it was worthless. Power without legitimacy was just violence waiting to fail. He placed the crown on the throne and walked away. 3 days later, the palace of Ashenmoor stood empty. Caspian had fled to the eastern territories with what remained of his personal guard. The council had dissolved. The throne sat vacant, covered in dust, a relic of a system that had consumed itself. Draven stood in the great hall where he'd once been crowned, where he'd ruled for 20 years, where he'd made the decision that had set all of this in motion. It felt smaller than he remembered, less significant, just stone and empty air and the weight of history that didn't matter anymore. Elena stood beside him, still transformed, but no longer radiating the same predatory menace. Her creatures had returned to the deep levels, not sealed away, but choosing to remain there, comfortable in the dark they'd claimed as home. What now? She asked. Now we build, Draven said. The people are ready. The councils are forming. The new structure is taking shape in 43 villages and growing every day. Will it work? Elena asked. I don't know, Draven admitted. Maybe it'll fail. Maybe we'll discover that people can't govern themselves, that hierarchy is inevitable, that we'll just end up recreating what we destroyed. But maybe not. Maybe this time it'll be different. Because we learned, Elena said. Because we learned, Draven agreed. Because we failed and survived and came back with scars that taught us what not to do. They walked out of the palace together, leaving the throne room empty behind them. Outside, the sun was rising over mountains that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, that would witness whatever came next with the same indifferent patience. The world was changing, not because someone with power had decreed it, but because people without power had decided they'd had enough. Here's what Draven had learned in 20 years of ruling and 3 months of wandering. Power doesn't come from crowns or thrones or the ability to command. It comes from the collective will of people who decide what they'll tolerate and what they'll tear down. And when that collective will shifts, when people stop accepting the old justifications and start imagining new possibilities, empires crumble overnight. He'd spent 20 years trying to be a better king than his father. Now he'd spend however long he had left trying to prove that kings weren't necessary at all. Elena looked at him as they descended the mountain path toward the territories below. "Do you think we'll succeed?" she asked. Draven thought about the parchment carried across 43 villages, about the signatures of people who'd never been asked their opinion before, about the councils forming in places where autocracy had ruled for centuries, about the possibility that change was actually possible when it came from below instead of being imposed from above. "I think we'll try," he said. "And trying is better than accepting. Fighting is better than surrender. Building is better than burning, even when burning feels like justice." "Even after everything they did to you?" Elena asked. "Especially after everything they did to me," Draven said. "Because I learned what happens when you let suffering turn into rage without direction. It consumes everything, including yourself. Better to turn it into fuel for construction than destruction." They walked in silence for a while, two people who'd been broken by the same system and had chosen different paths through the breaking. Eventually, those paths had converged, not in revenge, in revolution. The empire of Ashenmoor fell without a final battle. It simply stopped existing because people stopped believing in it. The throne sat empty for a generation before someone finally melted it down and used the metal for plowshares. The palace became a monument to what had been, maintained by volunteers who wanted people to remember both the glory and the horror, the achievements and the atrocities. The pits remained sealed, but not forbidden. People could descend if they chose, could see what desperation and cruelty had created, could understand the cost of systems built on disposal of the inconvenient. Most who went down came back changed. Some didn't come back at all, choosing to remain with the creatures who'd become something beyond human, beyond alpha, beyond the old categories. Draven lived another 30 years, never reclaiming power, never trying to rule. He traveled the territories helping build the council systems, mediating disputes, teaching what he'd learned about the corrupting nature of concentrated authority. He died in a small village surrounded by people he'd worked beside in the fields, people who remembered him not as a king, but as a man who'd learned from his failures. Elena outlived him by decades, her transformation making her effectively immortal in ways that were never fully understood. She became a legend, a warning, a promise. The girl who'd been thrown away and had returned as something that couldn't be controlled or contained or forgotten. She never took revenge beyond the revolution itself, never hunted down those who'd wronged her, never became the monster they'd feared. Instead, she became something they'd never anticipated, a guardian of the new system, a reminder of what happened when the old patterns tried to reassert themselves. She walked among the councils and the communities, transformed but recognized, feared but respected, a living symbol that some lines couldn't be crossed without consequence. And in time, the children who'd grown up in the new system stopped seeing her as frightening and started seeing her as simply part of the world they'd inherited. The world their parents and grandparents had built from the ashes of empire. A world that wasn't perfect, that struggled and failed and succeeded and tried again. But a world that had learned one crucial lesson. That power unchecked became tyranny. That hierarchy unquestioned became oppression. That people treated as disposable would eventually dispose of the system that discarded them. And that sometimes the only way to build something better was to let the old way die completely. Not with violence for its own sake, but with the determined, patient work of people who'd suffered enough and decided to try something different, even if it was hard, even if it was uncertain, even if it might fail. Because trying was better than accepting, fighting was better than surrender, and hope, however fragile, was better than the certainty of continued suffering. This was the legacy Elena and Draven built. Not an empire, a possibility. And possibilities, once planted, have a way of growing in unexpected directions. The girl they threw away didn't just survive. She became the reason empires learned to fear the discarded. The king who lost everything didn't just fade away. He became the proof that power could be surrendered without being seized by someone worse. Together they showed a world that had forgotten any other way that change was possible. Not easy, not guaranteed, but possible. And sometimes possibility is enough.